In this lecture, I'll be discussing political anthropology, theorists that have contributed to anthropologists' understanding of politics, as well as the work that anthropologists have been doing themselves. Here in this opening slide, here you see a picture of Michel Foucault at the top and Noam Chomsky. They're much known for their debate concerning the human condition and politics, as well as agency. For Michel Foucault, one of the most cited authors in the social science and humanities, he brings in Bentham's work on the panopticon. Foucault was interested in a wide variety of things, from prisons to psychology, psychiatry, as well as sexuality and control over bodies. Borrowing from Bentham, he notes that the panopticon, in the context of a prison, must be understood as a dream building, as a diagram. It is a diagram of mechanism of power reduced to its ideal form. So here you have one individual, potentially, or not even an individual, being able to watch a number of other individuals. And so it's the notion that one is potentially always under surveillance that speaks to this ability to control individuals and their behavior overall. So in this lecture, I'll look at political anthropology as a whole. We'll look at social organization and power as key elements of political anthropology. We'll look at Laura Nader's work on studying up Eric Wolf's description of different types of power, Gramsci's notion of domination and hegemony, Foucault's notion of biopower and governmentality, and then focus on ethnographic examples surrounding Hurricane Katrina. Political anthropology is the study of social power in human society. In political anthropology, there have been some distinct eras. In the first formative era, the first commentaries on political affairs, you had politics as initially being discussed in ethnographies. The classic era, you see a focus in ethnographies on politics, particularly in Africa, with Myron Fortes' African political systems. This lasts until about the 1970s, where you see the new era, where again, you have the questions that are emerging outside of the sciences, outside of the social sciences as a whole, influencing the directions of inquiry for science. So in the new era, you have questions of power and inequality in the context of globalization that are circulating concerning a number of justice movements, including the civil rights movement, in the United States, the American Indian movement, women's equality movements in the United States, and all of these galvanized to new challenges to structures of power. When we talk about politics, this is not divorced from economic activity. In fact, it's intimately connected with this in terms of resource allocations and limitations under the realm of scarcity in market level economies. Eric Wolf comes up with three different conceptualizations or types of social power. Power in a really general sense can be thought about as transformative capacity or the ability to transform a given situation. In 1994, Wolf outlined three types of power: interpersonal power, one person to another, one person imposing his or her will on another person; organizational power, where individuals or groups will limit the action of other people in a specific social setting, but not potentially others; and then structural power, where you organize this social settings in a larger scale to control the distribution of social labor. So an example of this would be clothing manufacture in El Salvador or Indonesia for European, Japanese, or American markets. In anthropology, for a long time, there was the notion of studying down, or studying those that were politically or economically marginalized. More recently, since the 1969, and with the turn of the new era in political anthropology, we see a shift to studying up, studying those in positions of political and economic power, studying the elites, studying the social structures, as well as the underlying justification for the social order. Some recent example of this comes from work of anthropologists and others. Brian Glenn, in his Law and Society article, looked at the shifting rhetoric of insurance denial, noting that different class citizens will be assessed different risk based on class positions, not relative risk of said hazard on their property. Leslie Gill looks at the School of the Americas in Fort Benning, Georgia, since been rebranded, and looks at military training and political violence in the Americas, conducting multi-sided interviews of individuals who have both been victims of human rights abuses as well as the perpetrators of human rights abuses themselves. Karen Ho, in her work on global capitalism, looks at the notion of presence in Wall Street banks. Often these are pseudo-presence with just a phone line connected up to a main switchboard overall. Now, there are a number of different ways to attempt to control individuals, and some would ascribe to the notion of coercion or physical force. There's also this notion of control by persuasion, and this is related to an overarching ideology. An ideology is a worldview that justifies the social arrangements under which people live, and it is a common way for political structures to gain their legitimacy. Karl Marx argued that people who accepted an ideology of domination by the ruling class were in fact suffering from a false consciousness. However, anthropologists as well as others have critiqued this, noting that this would portray people as passive and unaware of their own ideological indoctrination. Non-anthropologists who dramatically influenced anthropological thinking regarding power is Antonio Gramsci, who wrote the Prison Notebooks from 1929 to 1935. They're first published in English in 1971. Gramsci notes that coercive rule is expensive, so rulers should persuade people to accept an ideology which legitimizes their rule while providing some benefits in exchange. His notion of hegemony, the persuasion of subordinates to accept the ideology of the dominant group, by mutual accommodations that nevertheless preserve the ruler's privileged position. So it maintains the status quo while offering a quid pro quo or an exchange. Now, successful hegemony depends on controlling different groups who may question the official ideology and developing counter-hegemonic practices. So controlling the overall discourse, it becomes important in controlling the overarching ideology, which prevents any sort of revolt of individuals. So this rule by persuasion. Gramsci's domination or rule by coercive force and hegemony, rule by persuasion, can be applied to state institutions, particularly in the colonial context where new national ideologies had been developed overall. The most quoted individual in the social sciences is Michel Foucault. He has two main notions, first of biopower and the second of governmentality. For Foucault's notion of biopower, he looks at forms of power that are preoccupied with bodies, be it with the bodies of citizens themselves or the social body of the state. Much of this work he develops in the history of sexuality and the will to knowledge. He sees subjects as members of a population with individual sexual and reproductive conduct that interconnects with issues of national policy and power. And we'll come to this later when we're discussing issues of population and overpopulation, and then particularly whose reproduction needs to be controlled and whose reproduction is allowed to perpetuate, even in light of a crisis of potential overpopulation at the state level. European states in the Middle Ages were focused on preserving control by an absolute ruler, and this is embodied in Machiavelli's notion of the prince. But this becomes increasingly ineffective, and you start to see a movement towards household management in the realm of the economy and the utilization of statistics in order to be able to control and understand populations as a whole. Foucault's other notion of governmentality looks at the art of governing appropriately to promote the welfare of populations within a state. Rulers take preventive measures against foreseeable threats to the state, wars, famine, in order to protect the population, as well as protect their position as rulers of the state. Indeed, in 2008, during the World Food Crisis, we see a toppling of governments, a number of governments that were threatened by increase in famine, and with that, a decrease in overall satisfaction of government as a whole. Governmentality can be threatening in the context of states that are not always acting in the best interest of all members of the population. This is most evident in amongst even where you might see a large proportion of the population made up of a relatively politically marginalized group of individuals, such as the Maya in Guatemala. In terms of ethnographic examples, I like to focus primarily around the ethnographic work of anthropologists around Hurricane Katrina. As Robbie Etheridge notes, Katrina washed away the veneer of U.S. prosperity to reveal deep poverty and entrenched class lines that the larger U.S. public took to be vanishing, if not gone. Indeed, the Hurricane Katrina impacted the economically poor, marginalized, and politically marginalized much more so than the well-off in many areas of New Orleans. And indeed, this is a trend that we see globally as well. In terms of economic damages relative to GDP and mortality per 100,000 inhabitants of economies between 1961 and 2010, we see that higher income countries bear a much less burden in terms of the impacts of disasters overall. Nevertheless, the impacts were rather dramatic of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. The clip available on Bolt discusses Kanye West's blurting out of George Bush not caring about black people. And this was met by anthropologists with, at least by one anthropologist who titles her article, "Thank You, Kanye," who notes that individuals were certainly being threatened by the threat of martial law. And this calls into question the value of the state and what the state is for in terms of serving the population. Lubiano and Navarro cites to former First Lady Barbara Bush, who notes that so many of the people in the Houston Astrodome were underprivileged anyway, so this is working very well for them. And so Lubiano notes this is essentially becomes a war on the poor, which is business as usual, and there's lots of discussion about who deserves assistance versus not. Lubiano also notes that New Orleans is primarily African American and primarily poor, high incidence of poverty in New Orleans, and this casts a dark black shadow essentially on the people of New Orleans who are unable to appeal for government help as a whole. Lubiano also points to the lawlessness of government, of individuals and officials, and the discourse around people not having the sense to leave, as well as a hierarchy of looters. Lipsitz, in his article, "Learning from New Orleans, the Social Warrant of Hostile Privatism and Competitive Consumer Citizenship," notes that there have been many factors that led up to Hurricane Katrina and the disastrous long-term impacts felt on the population of the city of New Orleans. This is also well documented in Adams et al. Piece on Bolt, which is on chronic disaster syndrome, which notes, in fact, that the response to the disaster perpetuated the disaster itself. And so the disaster that was Hurricane Katrina that occurred in August of 2005 was ongoing for many years due to the government response, including FEMA trailers that cost upward of $200,000, including the annihilation of labor laws and environmental laws that subject local populations to increased risk and decreased employment or underemployment as a whole. There's also been a move towards gentrification, where old neighborhoods have essentially been wiped out in an effort to rebuild New Orleans and to reimagine New Orleans as a venture, as a place of prosperity and modernity as a whole. Lipsitz also notes that the military response is to New Orleans and the idea to take back the city, and he calls on this notion of competitive consumer citizenship, wherein you have government agencies, neighborhoods, and individuals encouraging hoarding along the notion of scarcity overall. And so this calls into interesting questions about identities as well as subjects, accumulators and citizens rather than workers and citizens. And Lipsitz also discusses that a number of turns in terms of elites being now also framed as the oppressed victims in a social engineering project. Lipsitz goes on to and continues that what happened in New Orleans is similar to what had happened in Iraq in terms of rebuilding with 12,000 mercenaries as an end in itself. And this becomes a model for rebuilding New Orleans along the lines of increased privatization of public spaces and public functions into private operations. And this becomes what Naomi Klein, in the context of disaster capitalism, refers to as new opportunities to build economic prosperity and wealth for a select few while causing suffering for others as a whole. And so the question becomes, what is New Orleans and how do people imagine New Orleans? And New Orleans is often imagined as a spectacle where you have Mardi Gras and the throwing of beads, but it can also be thought about as a place of lived history, of resistance, of music and art, and the formation of communities overall, particularly self-help communities like the Mardi Gras Indians. These are neighborhood mutual aid societies. And as mentioned before, the resource poor had more to lose, particularly with their networks, than many of the rich in the area. Finally, Robbie Etheridge, in his work, goes through a number of assumptions surrounding Hurricane Katrina and notes, in fact, that social contracts are not binding, infrastructures are not durable, disaster zones are not fathomable. The social order does not, in fact, disintegrate within a disaster, but it actually gets stronger. Victims are active rather than passive, and that outside assistance in a disaster the size of Hurricane Katrina really is necessary overall. So individuals working without expertise would provide very little for the overall scope of the disaster. So I hope to have provided you with an overview of political anthropology in terms of social organization of power, Laura Nader's notion of studying up, Gramsci and Foucault's notions in theory, as well as the ethnographic example